I am Joe O'Keefe, Dean of the Lynch School, and I am delighted to welcome all of you to the 7th Annual Lynch School Symposium. To those of you from the BC community, welcome. And for our alumni and friends from off campus, welcome especially to BC. Each year, this Lynch School Symposium provides an important opportunity for serious examination of an issue that impacts the life of children and families in a significant way. This year, we are joining with the Center for Human Rights and International Justice to think together about issues of education and immigration. Complex issues like education and immigration require the type of multidisciplinary approach that the Center embodies so well, with Dan Kanstrom from theology, David Hollenbach from theology, Dan Kanstrom from the law school, Don Hafner from political science, and our own Brenton Likes, a professor in the Lynch School and associate dean, who bring to bear these various perspectives. And certainly we are very pleased to co-sponsor this event with the Center. But before we move on to the program on education and immigration, let me say a few words about the Lynch School. Along with providing the opportunity for serious examination of an important policy issue, the symposium also offers an opportunity to take stock of where the Lynch School has been and where it is heading. Now, I could use the 2 hours to talk nonstop about the school, but I won't. But let me give you a few highlights of this past year. Certainly, we continue to be recognized nationally and increasingly internationally by a number of measures, one of which is the U.S. News and World Report rankings of graduate schools of education, where we remain in the top 20. We are recognized in the press. The cover story in the Chronicle of Higher Education last March saw our outstanding leadership in the realm of partnerships between university and local communities. Certainly, we were recognized locally, the Boston Globe editorial that looked at the mayor's new initiative called Step Up to work intensely 5 private universities with the poorest performing public schools in the city. And the Globe in its editorial held up as the one shining example of a university that does work in the grassroots with the community, the Boston Connects program, which is out of the Lynch School of Education. Certainly, I think the measure of any quality school of a university is the kind of people that we can attract to our faculty. And we had a banner year last year, 6 new hires, 2 in endowed chairs, and 4 assistant professors, all of which were the first choice of their search committees. And I can tell you, as the one who does the bargaining, that they had spectacular offers elsewhere and chose to come here largely because of the mission of the school, which certainly attracted them. We continue to have success in external funding, both government funds and foundation and corporate funds, to support the scholarship in our work, a scholarship that very often has a positive impact on the lives of children and families, a mission-driven scholarship. And we were delighted to receive new endowment funds. A new fund, the Bradley Fellows, $1.6 million endowment fund to help students study moderate special needs on the graduate level, seeing the great need for that in schools. And looking at funds to further the collaboration that we have with our arts and science colleagues in the preparation of teachers, a $1.2 million endowment fund. And then also $1.1 million gift to our Center for Catholic Education to both investigate issues that are working in urban Catholic schools and provide a venue through which those findings can be disseminated. Certainly our success is based on the dedication of all of my colleagues, no question about it, but also the commitment of students, faculty, staff, and alumni. And it is our alumni and friends of the Lynch School through whom we are able to do what we do, and I am certainly grateful for the benefactors here among us. So while so much is new within the school in this past year and in the past several years, a major aspect of our mission has remained constant over the past 54 years, and that is the preparation of teachers of the highest quality, women and men of great intelligence, and of great compassion and dedication. Tonight, along those lines, we institute a new dimension of the annual symposium, which is a student-initiated program to bring to campus beloved former teachers of our seniors. And here to tell us about this new program is Jillian Daly of the class of 2008. Jillian.
Good afternoon. My name is Jillian Daly, and I'm a junior early childhood education and human development major here at the Lynch School. I'm also the vice president of Lynch School of Education's Undergraduate Senate. I would like to welcome you to our 7th annual symposium, and specifically to the first ceremony to honor exemplary educators. The Senate decided at the end of last year that we would initiate this program to honor teachers that our own seniors had been inspired by, either in elementary school or high school, before coming here to Boston College. It's so important as students of education to look to real people and models of what a good teacher should be. With that, I'd like to thank some of the people who made this event possible. Thank you to each senior who nominated a teacher, and to Dean John Cawthorn and the other members of the Senate committee for all their hard work. Also, thank you to Bill McDonald for his help with the program, and of course to our teachers for inspiring these students and for making the trip to our ceremony this evening. As the chairperson of this event, it has been a privilege to read all of our seniors' nomination letters and to get to know their amazing teachers through these stories. If we went back 16 years to when the students of the Lynch School were in kindergarten, and we asked them what they wanted to be when they grow up, we would probably hear many of them say, "I want to be a teacher." The teaching bug catches you quite young. But revisit these students after that day at recess when they fell off the swing, that volcano project they loved in the 4th grade, that book their 7th grade teacher gave them to read, or that required course in high school they didn't want to sign up for but ended up loving. Ask our students what they wanted to be then, and they would say, "I want to be that teacher." Miss Meyer, Mr. Keppel, Miss Lanahan, and Miss Nealon were that teacher to our nominators, and I hope that their stories are as inspirational to you as they have been to the seniors and to the Senate. To conclude, I hope that the class of 2008 will continue this tradition by nominating their teachers this spring. First, to share their nomination, I would like to introduce Kate Tebow, who nominated Mr. John Keppel.
There he stands, leaning against the wall in the bustling hallway of Stoughton High School with a pleased look upon his responsive face. His eyes are glazed over, and his smile only seems to grow as the minutes pass. He is in his own little world, and the hundreds of boisterous students in the halls could only make him more content. Bryan Adams' Summer of '69 is heard coming from his classroom, directly across from where he is standing. Occasionally, his head bobs to the tune of the song, and his lips mimic the words of Bryan Adams. All too soon, the bell rings, and his altered state of conscience is quickly transformed into an energetic teacher. "Good morning," he shouts at the top of his lungs. An unsuspecting class murmurs their returning greetings. By the look on our faces, he knew that we didn't know how to react, and he immediately laughs out loud. I didn't know it at the time, but I would forever remember that contagious laugh. He turns off the music and introduces himself as Mr. Keppel, our 11th grade history teacher. He begins the class by inquiring, "What is normal?" This statement catches us all by surprise, but before we can formulate an answer, he amazes us once again. He excitedly puts on rollerblades and a white button-up suit. The class is silent as he adds the finishing touch of a child's hat with a spiraling windmill atop it. The next thing we know, he is rollerblading down the hall. After a couple of minutes, he returns and immediately questions, "What is normal?" I learned a lot about history that year, but I also learned a lot about life.
And Mr. Keppel is going to respond.
Thank you. I'd like to thank the Lynch School for this opportunity. It's a wonderful idea, concept, to have this recognition of teachers. Every day is a gift. Each day we have on this planet is a gift, and I've been fortunate to be able to share the wonderfulness of that in a career that I have a passion for. And I'd like to thank Kate especially for the nomination. She's the quintessential student, and it's for people like her and others that I pursue this career. Thank you very much.
Next, we have Ms. Megan Ghostman, who nominated Ms. Maria Lanahan.
No words could do justice when describing Miss Lanahan and the way that she has impacted not only my education, but my life. I am worried that no matter what I say, my feelings will seem generic, and Miss Lanahan deserves more than that. She has helped me shape my life goals, uncovered my desire to travel, and has shown me the kind of teacher I would like to be one day. Although her class was challenging, I still continued to look forward to it each day. She always thought of innovative ways for us to learn the material. For example, when learning about the Spanish vocabulary words for vegetables, Ms. Lanahan asked each student to bring in a variety of vegetables. We split up into groups and were asked to build something using our vegetables. When our masterpieces were completed, Ms. Lanahan walked around to each group and quizzed us on our understanding of the vegetable vocabulary. It would have been easy for her to simply tell us the Spanish translations for all of the vegetables, but she took the time to develop a lesson that was both fun and educational. Aside from her role as a teacher, Ms. Lanahan interacted with me outside of the classroom. She always asked if everything was going well and made an effort to attend school events on the weekends. Ms. Lanahan often visited my friends and I at the weekly football games to watch us cheer. She knew that it was important to me and wanted to be able to share in that aspect of my life as well. I am currently a secondary education and Spanish major at Boston College. I would like to follow in the footsteps of Ms. Lanahan and become a high school Spanish teacher. As a result of being a Spanish major, I decided that I would like to spend a semester abroad in a Spanish-speaking country. I have recently returned from Quito, Ecuador, where I spent 4 months learning about a new culture while also learning about myself. My trip to Ecuador forced me to step outside of my comfort zone and explore and experience things that I never thought could be possible. I lived with a family, attended classes at the local university, and taught first graders in an elementary school. I believe that without the help of Miss Lanahan, I may not have discovered my love for the language and my love to travel. While delivering a small speech about me at my National Honor Society induction, Miss Lanahan referred to me as a precious little gem. Ironically, over 3 years later, I have realized that she has been mine. She has helped me uncover my true passions in life, a gift for which I can never show enough gratitude. Miss Lanahan has been my teacher, my mentor, and my friend, but above all, she has been my guiding light. Without her support along the way, I may never have discovered my passions in life. I only wish that I could begin to show her the appreciation that I have and all that she has done for me. She will always hold a special place in my heart, but sometimes, no matter how strong the feelings, words are just unable to do justice.
If Ms. Lanahan would join us.
I too would like to thank the Lynch School. My career has flown by, and it's because of students like Megan, whose enthusiasm and appreciation of learning is the fuel that makes teaching so rewarding. It's a profession that's hard for me to leave after 38 years. People ask me, why haven't you retired yet? Aren't you tired of doing the same thing for so long? How do you explain to people that it's not the same thing? Teaching is learning, and in learning there is growth, and that growth creates a passion. And it is the sharing of that passion with your students that hopefully inspires them to learn, and with that, enjoy all that life has to offer. In a note that I wrote to Megan that I would like to share with you, I thanked her for sharing with me the impact that I had on her life. There is no greater gift than telling someone that they made a difference. So many times these words are not shared. Her timing is perfect. What better way to top off a career that has meant so much to me? You have a great gift, Megan. You will be a wonderful teacher. Your enthusiasm for life and adventure and your caring ways are the ingredients for success and fulfillment. Deseo solamente lo mejor para ti.
Next, we have Sarah Gant, who nominated Miss Lynn Meyer.
Lynn Meyer greatly impacted my life while I was in her classroom and now that I am an adult. I had her as a teacher for both 4th and 5th grades, and her classroom was always an oasis of creativity. I especially appreciated how Mrs. Meyer strove to challenge me intellectually. I was always a more advanced student, especially in the areas of reading and writing. I was always reading at home, but could never tear myself away from the Babysitter's Club series. Mrs. Meyer knew that I could be challenged much more than that, so she also tried to recommend good books and versions of the classics that I might enjoy reading instead. Before winter break, she gave every member of the class a book that she had purchased for them herself. Mine was the unabridged version of Little Women. I still remember being awed at how many pages it was and determined that I would finish it. That book became one of my favorites, and I still have it today. Mrs. Meyer also noticed I loved to write and tried to challenge me in this way as well. She encouraged me to write poems, and when I did, she had me read them to the rest of the class. I was always a fairly shy student, so it did wonders for me to share a piece of myself with my classmates, and it helped me to develop self-confidence and an identity as a writer. Mrs. Meyer also referred me to writing contests, and through one of them, I had a poem published in a book, probably the highlight of my elementary school career. When I think ahead to whom I want to be as a teacher, it is Mrs. Meyer's classroom that I most hope to emulate. Recently, I was completing a unit on teaching Greek mythology to 5th graders, and I remembered an activity that we had done in her classroom. I was able to locate her email address and emailed her asking if she still had a copy of the play we wrote based on the Persephone myth. She did, and she also offered to send me a whole variety of materials that she uses to teach Greek mythology. Collaborating with the teacher from elementary school was a bit surreal for me, but it was so wonderful to know that she is available as a resource for me as I become a teacher. I hope that I can someday inspire the students in my classroom the way she inspired me.
Miss Meyer?
When Sarah showed up at my doorstep this summer with this little letter saying, "Would you come to Boston and spend the day with me?" I couldn't believe it. I said, "Are you kidding me? Are you kidding me? This doesn't happen to teachers very often. You know, we occasionally, get invited to someone's graduation open house, or you see them out in the community. And I have the honor of being a neighbor of Sarah's, and so I was able not only to teach her for 2 years, but to also watch her play with my own sons. They did a little boxcar skit in my backyard, Boxcar Kids, and they had all these elaborate kinds of imaginary games going, so it's been a lot of fun. As you heard Sarah talk about, she's a passionate writer, and today we had a lot of fun. I was able to get a copy of a book that Sarah put together in 5th grade. And so we've been walking down memory lane and looking at her dream house, and someday I'll be an actress, and someday I'll be a princess, or gonna go on a cruise, and someday I'll be a famous writer. And I just want to share just briefly a few paragraphs from her 5th grade graduation speech. Sarah was always big about using metaphors in her writing, and so with the graduation speech, it went through kindergarten through 5th grade. So I'll just read the introduction paragraph and then her conclusion paragraph. And I must tell you that I shared this with my class yesterday before I came here on this trip. And they said, "You have to read the whole thing, you have to read the whole thing." I said, no, I think I've only got a minute. So it goes like this. "Today is my last day of being a Greenleaf Gator. As I stand here today, my mind is full of all the pleasant memories that I will take with me to middle school. In a way, my years here at Greenleaf are like a jigsaw puzzle. Putting a jigsaw puzzle together is not always easy, but the finished product is always rewarding. Today my puzzle is finally complete, and putting it together was a great adventure. And then she goes on to her kindergarten memories all the way up through 4th and 5th grade when I had her. And then her conclusion is, standing here reflecting on Greenleaf memories, I know that my years have been rewarding. My puzzle is complete and I am proud of it. I feel the way you always feel after finishing a puzzle. Happy that you've completed it, but sad that you are finally done with all your hard work. Indeed, I am happy and excited for middle school, but I also will miss being here at Greenleaf. I'd like to thank all the teachers for helping us get ready for middle school. I know that I will always have memories of this school etched into my mind. I must always cherish my first puzzle and try my hardest on my next one. We all must do our best to succeed in the puzzle of life. And I tell you, that was a 10-year-old writing. And I have no doubt that there have been a lot of puzzles, and you are just getting to probably the 10,000-piece one as you graduate from Boston College. But it certainly sounds like you are very well prepared. We spent the whole afternoon touring around, and Sarah talked an awful lot about all the experiences she's had in the field and getting to do internships and practicums and, a whole month here and a whole month there. And it sounds like she's picked a career that she is passionate for, and I have no doubt that she's going to be a credit to our profession. So Sarah, thank you so much.
Finally, I'd like to introduce Michael Norman, who nominated Miss Sue Nealon.
I just want to take a quick minute to thank Jillian and Father O'Keefe and Dean Cawthorn for allowing us to have this opportunity to nominate these people that had such an impact on our lives. I was asked to read a minute or two of my speech, but I'd rather just speak for a minute or two if that's okay. The first impression I got of Miss Nealon was when I received a letter from her over the summer. Going into 4th grade, I had never heard of Miss Nealon before. She was a new teacher at the school, and I was very nervous going into that first day, what it was going to be like. And I received this letter on very nice flowered paper, introducing herself and just saying how she was nervous coming to a new school as well. And it just was such a warm feeling for me to know that she was feeling the same things that we were, and everything was going to be okay. So that was the first impression I ever had of Miss Nealon. Another memory that I have, we put on a production of James and the Giant Peach over the course of the year, and I wanted nothing more than to be the earthworm in this show. And we came to the day for auditions, and I was all set to audition for the earthworm, and Miss Nealon surprised me by saying, "Actually, Michael, I had this vision yesterday that I think you would make a great Aunt Sponge." So needless to say, several months later, I portrayed a round, snobby old woman in the play, and it was one of the most amazing experiences, one of my favorite memories from that year. When I left elementary school in 5th grade, the one person that I wanted to make sure I got a chance to go and say goodbye to was Miss Nealon. I had had teachers, administrators, friends from the school for those years, and yet the person that I spent my final minutes at that school bawling my eyes out with was Miss Nealon. The one thing that does stand out most in my memory about her was her compassion, her energy, her enthusiasm, her sense of humor. In my 16 years of school, I can't remember anyone creating such a loving, caring environment in the classroom as Miss Nealon. So thank you very much, and it's an honor that you were able to join us here today. So, Miss Nealon.
Miss Nealon will join us.
Michael spoke about it's an honor to have me here, and I actually feel sort of the opposite. It's really an honor for me to be here. And I was talking to a high school teacher that I had back in the day last night about this award, and we were talking about how difficult it is to sometimes feel recognized for the work that we do as educators. We work with children and we kind of send them along, and then we don't always hear from them again or find out what happens to them. So sometimes we're lucky enough and we do, but we don't always. And Michael's always had a very special place in my heart, and I think the fact that he's had so many wonderful teachers, and I know this because I know many of the teachers that he's had, and of all those wonderful teachers, the fact that he chose to recognize me as somebody who's made a difference, to me, is just an incredible, incredible honor. And I thank you for that, Michael. And thank you for this opportunity.
To conclude, I'd just like to thank all of our nominators and teachers for making the journey here tonight to make our first ever Honoring Teachers Award such a success. Thank you.
Thank you, Jillian, and thank you especially to Associate Dean John Cawthorn, who really spearheaded the efforts to pull all this together. So, John, I'm very grateful for this. Thank you. And now on to our symposium. Cognizant of our identity as a Catholic and Jesuit university, and in recognition of the special role we play in regard to education, it is important to heed these words of the Catholic bishops of the United States. Quote, "We commit ourselves to continue to work at the national level to promote recognition of the human rights of all people, regardless of their immigrant status, and to advance fair and equitable legislation for refugees and prospective immigrants. Present efforts need to be strengthened and supported with new initiatives, both at the local level and at the national level, as U.S. immigration law and practice change in the face of changing political pressures and social realities. In particular, Catholic lay people, diocesan officials, and bishops should continue to work together with community organizations, labor unions, and other religious bodies on behalf of the rights of immigrants in the workplace, in schools, and public services, in our legal system, and at all levels of government. Tonight, the Lynch School of Education, in conjunction with our Center for Human Rights and International Justice, joins other Catholic Church-related organizations in bringing to the forefront of our attention and concern educational opportunities for the immigrants among us. Leading our discussion is Father Richard Riskavich of Fairfield University. Following his remarks, we will hear from two respondents, Dan Canstrom of our law school and Iris Gomez of the Massachusetts Law Reform Institute. Following their comments, we will be taking questions from the audience. Please join me in welcoming our distinguished panel this evening.
Good afternoon. It's a privilege to be here, especially listening to those wonderful examples of student-teacher relationships and how teachers teach students and students become teachers. You know, it's a wonderful cycle and a very concrete one. I really was quite moved to hear that. I think some of you may think that my remarks tonight are ill-fitted for a discussion about education, particularly secular education, or what you might call public education, because I'm going to speak mainly from a religious point of view. But I think it's extremely important for Catholics and non-Catholics to understand the roots of the Church's concern for immigrants, particularly in today's society. I was recently appointed by the Holy See to be a member of the Vatican delegation to the 61st session of the United Nations General Assembly. And the week before the heads of state addressed the opening of the General Assembly, the Secretary General Kofi Annan convened a ministerial meeting of member governments to talk about what he called the high-level dialogue on migration. And I sat there and listened while government after government got up in the president's chair and talked about the importance of migration as a social policy for their countries. I don't think there was a country in the room that didn't make migration a priority in their own country's issues or problems. But it was only the Holy See and maybe a handful of governments who took the podium and spoke about the migrants themselves and the importance of protecting the dignity and the rights of the migrants. It's no exaggeration, I think, to say, and many people have said it, that the Catholic Church is the most influential institution in the world, consistently and regularly standing up for the proper treatment of people on the move. Catholics in the pews, even, are sometimes surprised to find migration as an issue that unites rather than divides the conservative and liberal leadership of the Catholic Church. In my many years as head of the Refugee and Immigration Office for the U.S. Catholic Bishops, migration was the one social justice issue on which the conservative and liberal bishops found common ground. In the various years that the migration committees were chaired by the likes of Cardinal Mahoney, Cardinal McCarrick, Cardinal O'Connor, Cardinal Law, Cardinal George, and they directed the pastoral and the political sort of activities of my office in support of immigrants. I never had to convince them to get involved in that work. Their support of immigrants was almost instinctive. So the first question I want to talk to you today is why? Where does this concern for immigrants come from? I can tell you from my personal experience that this question has puzzled members of Congress, the State Department, and the White House under at least 3 different administrations. Because they say, of all the social issues in the United States and the world, why does the church pay so much attention to migration and refugees? You know, going so far as to set up entire bureaucracies just to deal with the issue in the Vatican and in Washington. Now, some people answer that question quite simplistically. They might say, for example, that rather sentimentally, I think, migrants are victims and the church should always side with the victims of social injustice. But feeling sorry for victims does not get at the roots of the church's concern. It's far deeper than that. Others, who are more cynical, perhaps more political, say that the church is so concerned with immigrants because that is the future of the Catholic Church, at least in the United States. If the church in America is growing by about 1 million persons per year, much of that growth comes from newcomers. But that doesn't really explain why the church is so concerned in other parts of the world where the migrants and the refugees are really non-Catholics. I think of the service to the Burmese migrants in Thailand, for example, or Muslim refugees that I know my Jesuit refugee service deals with so much in Southeast Asia. It's true that many of the immigrants coming into the United States are Roman Catholics, and the church feels a sort of special responsibility for them. And it is true that the church in this country has had a long, long history of dealing with immigrants by setting up special structures for them, the national parishes, but also the schools. The Catholic school system in many ways was created for immigrants. This university was created for immigrants. But that doesn't really explain the core of the church's concern. Another explanation people give is that the church's engagement with migrants is to view it as a question of social justice, anchored in Catholic social teaching. This Catholic social teaching has been articulated by many popes in the 20th century, and it basically has to do with the principles that should undergird our whole life as citizens in the social world. And migration as a social phenomenon then has to be approached from the point of view of these principles. I'll talk about that a little later. But I don't think even Catholic social teaching is at the root of the church's concern for migrants. I think the political and the pastoral behavior of the church toward migrants can only be explained fully through a theological lens. Faith, not politics and not justice, is the explanatory root of the church's concern. To appreciate this would take sort of a lecture, I suppose, that takes you through history, but let me begin at the very beginning. Three of the great monotheistic religions, Judaism, Islam, and Christianity, share one astonishing commonality. Not just the fact that they trace their lineage back to the story of Abraham, but that the story of Abraham is essentially the story of God telling Abraham to migrate away from his homeland. The experience of God for all these religions begins to unfold in the process of migration. God meets his people in migration. To meet God, you have to migrate. And this migration call runs all the way through the history of Judaism, Islam, and Christianity. Judaism was the first religion to define itself in terms of migration through the physical movement of the Jewish people, from the wanderings of Abraham through the Exodus to the Babylonian exile. And here I mean both forced and voluntary migration. Migration was the primary crucible for the Jewish experience of God. God was a God of migrant people. And Christianity rooted itself squarely in that tradition. I only have to cite a few things to give you a flavor of that in Christianity. I mean, Jesus himself, his own itinerant ministry, where he says, the Son of Man has no place to rest his head. The infancy narratives about the Holy Family as refugees in Egypt, the sending out of the disciples by Jesus, the many travels of St. Paul and the other disciples, always pushing further into the empire and even beyond the empire of Rome. Is it any wonder that the earliest name for Christianity was the road, the way? So it wasn't much of a leap in the early church for the fathers of the church to define faith in terms of a journey, of a migration, of a movement of the Spirit. I could cite many examples in the early church of this, and I don't have the time, but one very important figure is St. Augustine, who really saw the world in a very modern way. I mean, he saw the world as a chaotic and very dangerous place to be in. And for him, we really should never feel at home in this world. Our real home is not here. Our home is in the city of God. And he actually had a term we translated as Christians as pilgrims. But what he really meant, what the term really means, is Christians are aliens. We're all aliens in this world, on this planet. This is not our real home. And we should never feel a sense of permanency in this life. Now, Augustine was not alone in that perspective. In fact, I was reading the other day where the letters of many of the bishops to the early churches begin like this, with a straight, almost like a formula. It says, an example would be, from the Christian community of Corinth, which is temporarily residing in Corinth, to the Christian community of Rome, which is temporarily residing in Rome. That's how they phrase, because they wanted to remind people that however you defined your homeland, this homeland was not a permanent home. And the concept of home is extremely important in the Christian tradition. Home seems like a very simple concept until you leave home, you know. I mean, an analogous thing is an adolescent going away to university. Once you leave home, all kinds of questions about self-identity and culture and family and life start to come up in a person's life. Well, if you think about a migrant as moving from one culture to another, you can multiply that experience 10,000 times for the migrant. And the concept of home then becomes a very confusing concept. You know, what is my home? I always like to say that of all the needs of the human spirit, probably the most basic is the need for a home, for roots, you know, for an anchor, because so much flows from that. The language and the culture and even the faith that gets defined in terms of where your homeland is. And the church really is trying to remind people that no matter how you re-anchor yourself in a new culture, in a new land, it will never satisfy totally your need for a home. Your roots are never safe, I guess is the way to put it in the Catholic terminology. And it was through that the church has, over the centuries, has tried to instill that in people. I mean, the whole question in the Middle Ages of a pilgrimage, maybe you've heard of the pilgrimages. I mean, these were ways of spiritualizing migration, including the attendant creation of hotels and services and food and shelter for people who were pilgrimaging, you know, moving from one place to another. In many ways, this was the origin of our modern hotels. Came through the same system. And Thomas Aquinas, probably our great central theologian in the Catholic Church, structures and plans his major work on the plan of a journey. He said that our life on earth is a journey to God, and the sacraments of the church are the rites of passage that mark life as a journey from baptism until death. And finally, we have in the Middle Ages the complex notion of Christendom, which created, at least theoretically, the model for a borderless world where people could move freely across political lines. And so when we come to the modern era, the church, which organizationally preceded the formation of the nation state and the modern borders, already had under her belt close to 2,000 years of faith-based reflection on the human phenomena of migration. And most of it is understandable only if you look at it through the lens of religion and faith. As we enter the 21st century, there are two guiding principles that form the bedrock of Catholic social teaching regarding refugees and migration. One is the Catholic belief in the dignity of the human person, formed in the image of God. This dignity is not given to someone by the state. It is inherent in every individual, and it applies to all people. Their legal status or their citizenship is quite irrelevant to this principle. And the second bedrock principle is the notion of the common good. There are different ways of defining this principle, but I would suggest it refers to the creation or the need for social conditions that allow people to realize their human dignity within a specific society. Now, it was out of these two ideas, distilled from centuries of thought, that the popes in the 20th century started articulating things like the right of human beings to work, or Pius XII, who articulated the right of people to migrate in search of work. The right to work, to seek work, was linked to protecting the family and the right to life. And each pope has built on the remarks of his predecessors, sort of building a kind of global theory of migration, I guess you say, or a theology of migration. But probably above anybody else, John Paul II devoted the most attention to the issue of migration and refugees. I counted over 70 addresses that he gave in his life where he took into account issues around migrants and refugees. And his primary contributions were of four, and I just want to lay them out for you tonight very quickly and then conclude. He believed that the legal definition of refugees should be broadened and made more generous to include other categories, including people who are internally displaced within their own country and people who, what we might call forced economic migrants. They're people who move for economic reasons because of poverty and other elements. He noted that it's very difficult to distinguish anymore between refugees, economic migrants, and internally displaced peoples. Secondly, John Paul believed that international law and treaties and international organizations need to be reformed and reviewed in order to protect migrant people. The old structures are either non-existent or they're not working. And this actually was the idea behind Kofi Annan meeting at the UN this past month. Third, John Paul argued for expanding the notion of solidarity, which may in the beginning be thought of as the kind of feeling you have for your fellow citizens, a kind of solidarity we have as a nation. He wanted to extend this beyond to a globalized sense of solidarity. The human race is a community of communities at the local, national, and international level that should be linked together in what he called globalized solidarity. And finally, John Paul called attention to the fact that although governments have a right to control their borders, this is never, at least in the Catholic perspective, an absolute right. Sometimes a people's right to life and survival can be more important than a government's right to block its border and criminalize entry. Now, most governments do not welcome any of these points. I can tell you from experience in Washington. But I think from what I've said, you can see why Cardinal Mahoney or Cardinal McCarrick get their courage to speak so forcefully about migration, even in the explosive context of American politics. All the major Catholic social agencies in the United States have joined for the first time with the bishops in a public campaign called Justice for Immigrants. The program is intended to educate the public, especially Catholics, about how immigration benefits the nation and to advocate for immigration reform. This represents a very visible and unique attempt by the Church in the United States to enter the political arena on the side of immigrants. It is also telling that the campaign is primarily aimed at Catholics, the assumption being that Catholics are as divided as the general citizenry on the issue of immigration. I would suggest that although this campaign is pragmatic and a form of public education, maybe a necessary form, something that's actually needed in our society today, it may miss the mark. It may position the church in a less spiritual and more political position than is necessary, and in so doing, alienate the very Catholics the campaign is trying to reach. Perhaps the common good today requires social conditions that promise the dignity of the human person and the unity of families, and this can only come from reform of our immigration system. That may be necessary. But we need to remember, particularly as Catholics should never forget, that the Church's migration position on migration is essentially a religious and spiritual position. Its wisdom and advice, even political advice, derives its credibility from spirituality. The primary message of the Church about migration is not about law, and it's not about legal immigration reform. It's about the migrant as a human person meeting God in the experience of moving. It's about how all Catholics need to protect that precious process and share in it spiritually, because Christ himself identified himself with the stranger, and how we are all strangers in a strange land. So all Christians should have this ontological solidarity, empathy for the migrants, based on our spirituality. Human migration mirrors how the Church views itself as a community of God. So as we face the challenges of the 21st century, I believe the Church, the collective wisdom on migration, distilled over centuries, will become ever more prophetic and relevant. You know, the Church witnessed the creation of the nation state. She knows the dangers of nationalism and xenophobia. She remembers periods in history when borders were more porous and less important than now, and she's comfortable in a globalized world. But most of all, she stands witness to the fact that there are no original peoples on this planet. Everybody came from somewhere else, and we are on our way to somewhere else. So I end with a quote from Leviticus. The Lord says, "This land is not yours. This land is mine. With me, you are all aliens." Thank you.
Well, I love the idea of Rick finishing with the idea of everybody coming from somewhere else. I came from Brooklyn, and I was really touched by the discussion about the teachers, and I just have to diverge from my remarks for a minute to tell you a little story about perception and reality. And my kindergarten teacher, I remember her as a sort of doddering, elderly lady with tremendous kindness in her heart, but, you know, basically somewhat, you know, a little decrepit, but so kind to me and so warm. And I remembered that her so kindly that when I was about 18, I went back to my kindergarten school just to see if anybody knew what had ever become of her. And I went there thinking she must, of course, have passed away. And I saw somebody there who I assumed was her daughter, who was still teaching with her name. And I went up and introduced myself to this woman who was about, you know, late 40s or 50, and said, "I was a student of your mother's. I guess you see where this is going." And it turned out that it was the same person. Well, in any case, it's an honor and pleasure to be with you here tonight. I spent my time training law students, which I found myself saying at a conference I spoke at last last week that it's an endeavor that is not unlike loading torpedoes onto submarines or ammunition into guns. I think the moral value of the endeavor depends a lot on where you aim. And it's really been inspiring for me to hear Rick speak of the deep consensus among Catholics about migration and the rights of migrants. Our programs here at the law school have certainly benefited from this kind of support over many years. In fact, Rick himself was instrumental in helping us to get our detention project, which has represented hundreds of immigration detainees and their families off the ground with support from the Jesuit Refugee Service and the Catholic Legal Immigration Network. And it's actually been quite fascinating for me over the years to see how my development of an immigration law clinic that works with poor asylum seekers and immigration detainees has been both sustained and justified for reasons that are actually rather different from those that motivated me to get involved in this challenging and often quite depressing work in the first place. I mean by this that I came to the work more out of a general political, legal sense of justice and compassion than out of any particular faith. It seemed to me 20 years ago, roughly, and it still does, that immigration and asylum and deportation defense work is one of, perhaps the major civil and human rights issue of our time. It resonates for the same kinds of deep reasons that slavery, segregation, racial discrimination did and do. It's a system that's based on an arbitrary criterion, citizenship status, to justify a range of often brutal and inhuman government actions against a discrete and insular and often voiceless and often rightless minority. It is, I think, at base, a system of power and control from which some benefit at the expense of others. Its historical roots stretch back not only to Westphalian notions of the nation state and sovereignty and control of borders, but functionally to exclusion and removal of poor people, forced banishment of convicts, fugitive slave laws, the removal of Native American Indians, racial exclusion and the deportation of Chinese workers in the 19th century, and so on and on. And beyond its inherent and historical deficits, it's a dangerous precedent for our legal system. As Thomas Jefferson noted more than 200 years ago, quote, "The friendless alien is selected as the safest first subject of a social experiment, but the citizen will soon follow," end quote. So viewed in that way, it's wonderful, but actually should perhaps be unsurprising that Catholic doctrine takes the position that it does and that it so easily converges with my own approach coming from a different tradition. But I'd like to consider, as a respondent to a talk among friends and, or at least I hope friendly academic critics, how far this position extends and how actually it challenges the political and legal concepts that lie at the root of our current system. I do this for two reasons. First, it has become clear in this country that we are deeply divided about these issues, and I am certainly not convinced that all who disagree with me about my vision of immigration and deportation are necessarily racist or immoral. There are some big questions here about which reasonable minds can differ, I think. And I think it's useful to try to distinguish those questions from others where we might draw a moral line, and should, I think. Second, more pragmatically, if we're going to convince others of the correctness of our positions, these positions must, I think, be as comprehensive, as precise, and accurate as possible. And behind all of this is a rather depressing fact. The system, if anything, seems to be getting harsher and harsher. Just today, years of apparently positive organizing of immigrants and the apparent support of the Bush administration has culminated in the president's signing of a new fence law. And here's what our president said today, quote, "Unfortunately, the United States has not been in complete control of its borders for decades, and therefore illegal immigration has been on the rise," end quote. Well, that's not a very stirring culmination to all of what we've been working on. In the realm of deportation, actually a biblical story that precedes Abraham, a kind of deportation narrative, the number of actual deportees are as impressive as they are little known. From 2001 to 2004, the total number of formal removal of people from the United States was over 720,000 people. and those who left pursuant to a grant of voluntary departure, which I can assure you is rarely voluntary in any meaningful sense, exceeded 4 million people. We're talking about a big system. In 2004 alone, the number of so-called deportable aliens located by enforcement authorities in this country exceeded 1.2 million people. What happens to these people? Who are they? Imagine a non-citizen who's arrested as a suspected undocumented alien or an overstay, or a criminal alien, even worst of all. Maybe because there was a tip or a workplace raid or a probation officer made a call, or even because the person looks undocumented on the street. This happens all the time. What rights will that person have? Evidence that could be seized in violation of the Fourth Amendment will not be suppressed. He will not be read Miranda rights. He will not be advised of the right that he has, that he might be able to hire a lawyer until after he's been interrogated. He will never have the right to an appointed lawyer, no matter what. He will never have the right to a jury trial. If he has a formal hearing before an immigration judge, he'll have certain very basic due process rights, but if he seeks an appeal of that decision, he may face incarceration during the whole process of that appeal, which could take years. And he might then get a summary decision from an understaffed Board of Immigration Appeals that's a product of 10 minutes or less review of his case, and he may get no federal court review after that at all. And many of these cases, many of them, are literally life and death cases. That's what we're talking about. So with these things in mind, let me just pose some tougher questions that derive mostly from the intersection, or in part from the intersection between education and immigration law, which is an area that fits within what we're gathered here to talk about. In 1982, the Supreme Court held in a case called Plyler versus Doe by a 5-4 vote that the undocumented children of undocumented non-citizens in Texas had a right to public school education. The court, though it did not view quote-unquote illegal aliens as a suspect class for purposes of equal protection analysis, meaning they didn't get the special benefits that a racial categorization might get, did say, and it rejected actually the argument that the state of Texas had made. The state of Texas basically argued that these children were not persons within the meaning of the Equal Protection Clause. So Justice Brennan wrote for the majority, quote, "Whatever his status under the immigration laws, an alien is surely a person in any ordinary sense of the term. Even aliens whose presence in this country is unlawful have long been recognized as persons guaranteed due process of law by the 5th and 14th Amendment," end quote. Now you might wonder why it was necessary for the court to actually say that, but I'm telling you, the state of Texas took the contrary position and said they're not persons. So the court specifically noted that, quote, "sheer incapability or lax enforcement of the laws barring entry into this country, coupled with the failure to establish an effective bar to the employment of undocumented aliens, had led to the creation of a shadow population within our borders." And the court recognized that this situation raised, quote, "the specter of a permanent caste of undocumented resident aliens," end quote, and that such a, quote, "underclass presents most difficult problems for a nation that prides itself on adherence to principles of equality under law," end quote. Now this was a watershed moment. It was a great breakthrough, in my opinion. But the hard question is this: how should we respond to those who now say that the best way to avoid the creation of a caste and an undocumented underclass is to prevent them from getting here in the first place? Consider today's fence law. Let's assume for the moment that such a fence could actually be built and that it could actually work. And those are big, expensive, and unrealistic assumptions. But what should our position be on that? To put it another way, does our call to conscience disregard borders and sovereignty entirely because we believe in fundamental human rights? If so, does this mean that citizenship is completely irrelevant for all of our purposes? These are hard questions, and I think we need to grapple with them. Consider the proper relationship also between religious and moral and ethical discourse and law. Here's what the dissenters in the Plyler case wrote, quote, "Were it our business to set the nation's social policy, I would agree without hesitation that it's senseless for an enlightened society to deprive any children of an elementary education. I fully agree that it would be wrong and folly. However, the Constitution does not constitute us as Platonic guardians, nor does it vest in this court the authority to strike down laws because they do not meet our standards of desirable social policy, wisdom, or common sense," end quote. Now, I would suggest that our call to conscience on this issue is really just the beginning part of how we can answer that sort of argument. And I certainly don't mean to minimize it in that sense, but I mean that we need a nuanced, comprehensive, multi-pronged, multidisciplinary, and technically acute assessment of the issues and our solutions to them. Here's a final hard question. Consider this. Had the federal government, immediately after the court decided the Plyler case, decided that these children could have the right to education, if the federal government had simply arrested and deported all of the affected children and their parents, it would have raised no cognizable legal claim under our law. Usually these days, when I give public talks, I focus on hard facts like this, that the nation of immigrants has in many respects turned into what I call a deportation nation. And that we have tens of millions of people living subject to this system. And family ties have become often irrelevant, as is hardship. Hundreds of thousands of people are deported, shattering families, creating a new American diaspora in Haiti, El Salvador, Cape Verde, and other places. This is not a hard system to challenge in operation, and its educational consequences are profound. But is all deportation fundamentally illegitimate? If we accept that some border control is legitimate, then when does it become illegitimate or unethical or immoral to remove people who have evaded those controls? What factors should count? Should it be where the person came from, why, how they came, how long they've been here, what family ties they have, what they'd face when they went back? These are the kind of questions that actually the law has to grapple with, informed by moral discourse, that more specific enterprise. And what about so-called criminal aliens? This is really a hard question for many people. Not so much in the minor cases, but what about in more serious cases? There's been actually a long questioning about this. Voltaire, hardly a Catholic theologian, once wrote, quote, "Not long ago, one banished outside the sphere of jurisdiction a petty thief, a petty forger, a man guilty of an act of violence. The result was that he became a big robber, a forger on a big scale, and a murderer within the sphere of another jurisdiction. It's as if we threw into our neighbor's fields the stones which incommode us in our own," end quote. These are all not hypothetical questions. They relate to the real hard question of what kind of rule of immigration and deportation law we would want to see if the House and the Senate change parties and real law reform becomes possible. I would conclude by suggesting that the inspiring leadership role taken by many Catholics on this issue offers a powerful and fruitful moral grounding upon which to begin to construct our answers to these hard questions. Ultimately, I can do no better than to echo Justice Frank Murphy, who wrote in Harry Bridges' case, quote, "Only by zealously guarding the rights of the most humble, the most unorthodox, and the most despised among us can freedom flourish and endure in our land," end quote. But there remains a great deal of work to be done.
Okay, I'm going to follow both those eloquent speeches with a little bit more nuts and bolts talk about some of the exclusionary realities that immigrants experience in becoming members of the community when they seek to educate themselves. How do we welcome the stranger in the land? And it's very interesting that the issue of higher education has become extremely prominent in the gubernatorial election. And on one poll, we have the, I'm just going to mention the primary candidates, the Healy campaign, which has come out very vigorously against providing tuition subsidized by the state to undocumented children who graduate from our schools and who are guaranteed the K through 12 education under Plyler that Dan spoke about. On the other hand, we have the Patrick campaign that believes or espouses a politics of hope, and who himself is a beneficiary of an education as the great equalizer that allowed him to rise from his roots, and who has been unwilling to reject the call for immigration restrictionists to eliminate that opportunity or not provide that opportunity to immigrant children merely because of their status. So echoing on the remarks regarding the importance of focusing on human rights that afford human beings dignity, education, I think we all agree, and certainly in this audience, in this school, is one of the measures of the way that we provide dignity to the stranger in our midst. So what I would like to do is talk about some of the ways that the higher education system in Massachusetts, through federal and state law, through policy and practice, excludes immigrant youth, documented and legal, and perhaps have a little bit of colloquy about what we might be able to do to repair these injustices. And I did a little two-sided handout of just some bullet points because some of this is information about laws, so just so that you have that information, you could pass that out and you can take that home with you. So I want to talk about the higher education system, which in my mind includes the 25 public institutions, the community colleges, the state colleges, and the university, UMass, as well as the private institutions like Boston College and others that are located in the state. And there are basically two kinds of barriers that immigrant youth face in accessing higher education. And I'm going to talk about barriers that apply to the public system as well as the private system. And these barriers have to do, on the one hand, with affordability, the ability of low-income immigrant youth to obtain an education, a higher education that they can afford, and admissibility, whether colleges in practice or by policy exclude immigrants from attendance. And the prototype of this for this discussion is a young woman who I have been working with, who was brought to the U.S. She was essentially a Plyler child. She was brought to the United States by her Brazilian family when she was 6 years old and attended schools in Massachusetts from the time she was 6 until she graduated just a couple of years ago. She was an excellent student. She was a member of her student government, a cheerleader, a member of a school dance troupe, and in many ways satisfied some of the indicia of success that some of you students have spoken about in terms of your own education and that your teachers have described. Yet, when she went to apply to colleges in Massachusetts, she discovered that she had no legal status in this country and that she was undocumented. And she encountered in the process of applying many different obstacles that have kept her from being able to earn her degree. And so she's an example of a person who would benefit from a change in some of these policies. But in addition, I want to bring out another example because it demonstrates that it's not only the undocumented immigrants who are caught in the net, so to speak, but immigrants with legal status. I have another client who came to the United States after being a political dissident as a student leader in her home country in Africa, who was tortured in detention and was granted political asylum to be able to be free of that persecution in the United States. She came here and what she wanted to do was study to be a nurse. Of course, she had no money, and she too applied to go to school and discovered that school was not going to be affordable to her because of her status. The school that she applied to demanded that she have a green card in order for her to obtain the in-state tuition rate. So these are just examples of some of the students, many students throughout Massachusetts who have the same sort of hope as the students here and the teachers to try to better themselves and contribute to the common good by obtaining professions that enable them to give more than cleaning houses or factory work, etc. So let me just talk about some of the affordability barriers that exist to higher education for immigrant kids. The first one is the financial aid rules. Legal requirements are extremely narrow as to which immigrants qualify for federal financial aid, which is the primary source of financial aid for students to go to college at a public or private school. And immigrants, for example, like the young African woman, while she was applying for political asylum, would not have been entitled to obtain a scholarship or, excuse me, a grant or a loan to attend the school of her choice because of the narrow list of statuses that financial aid is available for. Similarly, undocumented, purely undocumented youth like the Brazilian girl would not have been entitled to obtain financial aid, no matter how destitute. So the federal financial aid rules are a matter of federal law and are very restrictive. The state financial aid rules are not so restrictive under state law. There's actually no state law that says you have to have a particular status to get financial aid from the state. However, as a matter of policy, the public institutions that provide state tuition waivers, etc., define their eligibility rules to parallel this federal system. So instead of providing financial aid to immigrant youth who are not eligible for the federal financial aid, they exclude them as well. A third affordability barrier, the one that's been the subject of the electoral debate, is the whole in-state tuition issue. And here, let me explain that in Massachusetts, under state law, in order to get in-state tuition to attend a public institution, you have to be a resident of Massachusetts. And under federal law, if a state decides to make in-state tuition available based on residence, then they have to provide in-state tuition to U.S. citizens without regard to residence, which means that if they choose to provide in-state tuition to undocumented people as residents, they can't have out-of-state tuition at all. It becomes economically unfeasible. So as a result of this combination of state and federal law, undocumented youth, such as the Brazilian girl that I told you about, would be required to pay the out-of-state tuition, even though, as she heartbreakingly learned, people that she went to school with from kindergarten until high school and whom she competed against and did better in exams than when she was attending school. Even though her fellow students could pay the in-state rate, she was required to pay out-of-state tuition to go to UMass, to go to Bunker Hill Community College, to go to any public institution in Massachusetts. Quite an eye-opening experience for her. For the last few years, the state legislature has debated passage of an in-state tuition bill that would make higher education rates at the in-state rate available not based on residence, so that the federal law wouldn't apply, but based on having graduated from a public school in Massachusetts. However, that legislation has been unsuccessful, and that's the legislation that the Healy-Patrick argument has been about. However, there's an additional barrier for even the lawfully present immigrants that I described. Even though the federal law only bars the extension of the in-state tuition rate to purely undocumented people, the institutions, the public institutions, as a matter of practice, are applying the same law to people like this young African woman that I spoke about, who has legal status, a right to live here indefinitely, because the U.S. government has determined that it would be contrary to federal law to return her to her persecutors. And yet, the public institutions will not give her the in-state tuition rate either. That's a policy issue, and that bears a different kind of change than through legislation, but it's another barrier that the immigrant youth face. The other way in which college is made unaffordable, and that relates to the private institutions, not just the public ones, is that many institutions, and I've had phone conversations with all kinds of colleges, no one from Boston College, but I don't really know the practices here that well, but many of the institutional staff, even at the private colleges, assume sometimes that because there are all these federal barriers for immigrants to access benefits that are governmentally funded, therefore institutional scholarships and institutional aid, tuition waivers that private institutions give, must be restricted. And so do not extend these affordable ways of providing an education to the undocumented students or the legal students who are denied the opportunity to go in the state system because of the interpretations of the law that I was describing earlier about residence. Finally, the admission staff issue is another problem throughout the higher education system, public and private. And the people that work with the student applicants in the admission staff sometimes are very well-meaning and well-intentioned, but in other cases are not well-trained or well-informed, and again make assumptions about immigrants and whether they can even attend school based on partial information or inadequate training, or perhaps beliefs that they've internalized from the greater society. So for example, sometimes immigrants have been told, well, no, you have to have a green card just to attend Boston College, or you have to have a foreign student visa to attend a college in Massachusetts, or you must have a Social Security number, which of course has the effect of excluding undocumented people who are not eligible for a Social Security number. So misinformation that is given at the admission staff level throughout the system has the effect of excluding even those who try to get in. So I want to just suggest a few changes and maybe leave you with a proposal that we can discuss. But obviously, at the state level, a change in leadership would affect our higher education policies. We also need some legislative changes to correct some of the legal restrictions. In addition, I think Rick spoke about federal legislation to legalize the status of people who have been here for a long time and want to be part of the society. And one piece of legislation applies specifically to immigrant youth. It's called, rightfully, the DREAM Act, because immigrant youth dare to dream. And that would essentially permit immigrant kids who were brought here before the age of 16 and lived here for 5 years to obtain a conditional legal status, and then if they actually go to college or join the military, they get to become permanent, or they get to apply to become permanent, you know, if they keep their noses clean and don't get into trouble, etc. So some of these legislative solutions are also another remedy that ought to be pursued. At the institutional level, throughout the entire higher education system, there needs to be greater education and training for staff about what the true barriers are, so that these practical barriers are not established that keep immigrant youth from attending our schools. And then I guess I want to suggest that we need to develop models of inclusion in the higher education system, and that Boston College could be such a model. Perhaps it already is. But for example, with the establishment of a policy of welcoming undocumented students, including the provision of some sort of institutional assistance to undocumented students who try to get into the state, the public institutions, and are unable to afford that because of the high cost of attending at the out-of-state rate. Finally, I think the Boston College could also help to model inclusion by educating sister institutions about these barriers and how they might be eradicated, at least at the institutional level. So thank you for your time, and if I didn't write my phone number on this thing, but if you have issues within institutions that you're working with and wish to work on them, I'm at igomez@mlri.org, and I'd be happy to, only in Massachusetts, I know some of you are from other states, but I'd be happy to work with you on correcting those problems. Thank you.